Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Learn at Lunch webinar. Today, we will hear from Extension Farm Management Specialist, Dr. Courtney Burr, as she discusses direct-to-consumer marketing. You may ask questions through the chat window, and you can open the chat window by clicking the chat button at the bottom of the screen. Dr. Burr will answer questions at the end of the presentation, and more farm management resources are available on the eFarm Management page. I will share the link in the chat window. Dr. Burr, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Okay, so I know that direct-to-consumer meat sales is really top of mind for a lot of people. This is part of a bigger program that we are building. Eventually, we will have an online course. We will have in-person workshops regarding these topics. So this is just a little piece of that. Today, I'm going to go into more detail regarding custom exempt slaughter. I will say that what I'm telling you today is the letter of the law. So what I'm telling you today are the exact recommendations of how to do this through the USDA. This may not be how it's been done before. This has a lot of details in it of exactly what's expected. So just kind of take that in mind that, not necessarily everyone may be following these rules to a T, but what I'm presenting today is kind of the letter of the law brought down by the USDA. So just to orient ourselves a little bit, so types of slaughter facilities. So the way that you have your meat inspected impacts what you can do with that meat. So we have federally inspected, state inspected, and TA Act inspected facilities. Today, we're focusing on custom exempt. Custom exempt, for the most part, is a little bit more accessible because you don't have to have that state or federal inspection to do custom exempt. There are a lot more options for you available in terms of finding someone who does custom exempt slaughter. Having said that, there are rules in terms of what can be done with the meat. So this meat cannot be sold or donated. It must be consumed by family or non-paying guests of the owner of the livestock. And so the key to this is that you are technically selling a live animal that is then processed and picked up by its new owner. And so that's why it's saying family or non-paying guest. So how does custom exemption work? So it is not state or federally inspected. You can sell a quarter, a half, a whole live animal to a consumer. You then take the already sold live animal to be processed. So it's perfectly fine for you to take the animal to the processor. The consumer can also pick up the live animal and take it to the processor. So that part's fine. The consumer picks up the meat. This is in the big USDA document. It says that the consumer must pick up the meat. Meat can be consumed by the buyer of the live animal and by non-paying guests. So if the end consumer, let's say, has a bed and breakfast type establishment, they cannot give a guest this meat to eat because they are a paying guest of the bed and breakfast. Meat cannot be sold as individual pieces. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about all these individual pieces and some considerations to think through. So this meat will be labeled not for resale. And so here we have the example of two of the main types of packaging. You have the vacuum seal packaging in the middle. You have the paper packaging to the right. It is more common if you have bone-in cuts that they will want to do paper packaging because the bones can go through that vacuum seal. And so these are all questions that you need to be asking the processor. If you have a strong preference or your client has a strong preference for vacuum seal, asking how that meat will be sealed is an important step for you. The key is it will be marked not for resale. Okay, so here are some general considerations for the live animal sales. Is there a custom exempt plant near you? Do they process the animal you are selling? Poultry can be tricky. So we do tend to talk a lot about beef because beef is one of the #1 live animal sales that happens, but you can do this with other animals. You can do this with goats. You can do this with sheep. You can do this with poultry. The issue is finding a place that slaughters those types of animals. Communication with the end buyer is key. So I will have a little slide coming up to kind of talk about the discussions you need to have, but communication with that end buyer to make sure that they know what to expect, to know the process. I think one of the big shocks for end buyers is often the amount of meat that you get. So people tend to Google, how big is a cow? And they say, oh, a cow's, 1,200 pounds. I expect to get 1,200 pounds of meat, and that's just not the case. The end buyer picks up the meat. And are there enough people interested in a quarter or a half or a whole animal near the processing plant? So sometimes, it just may be a matter of interest, and that's your job as the producer to figure that part out. And then do you know the quality of the meat from your cattle? So a lot of people who are interested in direct-to-consumer meat sales, they really want to hear the story of your farm. And to some people, that is a huge selling point, to know exactly who raised it, to know the conditions and all of those things. Other people really care about quality. And so having done this before yourself, knowing what your meat is like and be able to describe that to the end consumer so there's no surprises is a really great thing. Okay. So 100% of the animal must be sold at the time of slaughter. So it doesn't have to be the same person. You can have family A buying a half, family B buying a quarter, and family C buying another quarter. But when you take that animal to slaughter, you need to be able to tell that processor, okay, here's the names of the families, A, B, and C. So you can't take an animal to slaughter and say, I only have half of this animal sold. It has to be 100%. This can be any combination of buyers. There are no rules saying that you have to do quarters and halves or wholes. You can sell 1/16 of an animal. The issue is the processor may not want to do this for you. And so a lot of times if somebody only wants a quarter of a quarter or a half of a quarter, it may be multiple family members going in. And so you just sell that family a quarter and then have them sort it out amongst themselves what individual cuts that they want to get. I will go through the costs of doing this for the processor fees. And so some processors actually charge more for quartering than halving. So there may be additional fees that you have to let the consumer know about. So finding a processor, you need to know when your animals will be ready for slaughter. So this is again something to communicate with both the processor as well as with the end consumer. You will likely have to book that slaughter date in advance. There may be some end consumers who contact you and say, I want it to go to XYZ processor. And that's a discussion that you can have with them if you want to take it to that processor. I think for the most part, most consumers trust you to make that appointment with the processor. So that's something that you will have to do. Unfortunately, you may not have a lot of processor options. So dependent on your location, there may be only 1 or 2 places that slaughter the particular animal that you're looking to sell. There just may not be a lot of options for you. So processor considerations. So first of all, are they easy to work with? Traditionally, what happens is you pick the processor, you say the date, and then you give the consumer the processor's phone number, and they call that processor, or the processor calls them and goes through the fabrication specifications. This interaction, unfortunately, is out of your control. And so this is part of talking to the processor, making sure that they know like this customer is important to you, the kind of services that they offer, maybe giving the customer a heads up in terms of what options they may have. A lot of these customers are not familiar with some of these cuts of meat, especially when you get into the roasts and things like that. So they may have questions for you. How have you had your animals processed in the past? So having that conversation and having a little bit of meat science knowledge is important. And then, of course, what kind of packaging do they use? So you can let the consumer know, like, you maybe have an option to do paper wrap versus vacuum seal. Maybe they only do paper wrap, maybe they only do vacuum seal. And then are they going the extra mile to have nice looking cuts? This is something that you will probably get feedback on. So if a producer is or I'm sorry, if a processor is not doing a great job with the cuts, if the cuts look sloppy, if it's not packaged well, you will probably hear this from your customer. And so that's either the time where you have to have a conversation with the processor or choose another processor. So these are all issues that you have to kind of think through. Here's some processor pricing examples. So I just picked 3 examples. These prices probably vary quite a bit between the region you're in Oklahoma, how many processors there are, what options they offer. But here's just some examples to kind of let you know what to expect. And it's important to remember that the end consumer is the one who is paying these fees. You as a producer cannot pay the processor. So the harvest fee for a head of beef at FAPSI across the street from my office is $200, and it's $100 for pork and lamb. They do not do poultry right now. So the custom processing is 75 cents a pound, and that's for cut, grind, and vacuum pack. Again, we just picked random processors. So Big Country, their harvest fee is $85 for beef, 75 for pork, and 160 for a goat. The custom processing is 99 cents, but then you have additional options. So to tenderize or make patties, that's an additional 75 cents. To cure pork is another 85 cents. And then they also have a disposal fee of $15. So the fatted calf is another processor, and their slaughter/disposal is $75. If they have some weights listed. If the animal is extra large, it's an additional $30. The processing is 90 cents. And this is what I was talking about. So if you want that animal quartered, it's an additional $10. If you want tenderizing, that's an additional $3. So they have a bunch of these options that you can choose from, and each processor has a little bit of a different way of doing things. So asking for the pricing, asking to look at the sheet. So here's some examples of the sheets that the end consumer would receive. So on the left, I want to say this is the fatted calf. And then on the right, we have FAPSI. And so they go through these options and they can say the thickness. They can say, I want, the steaks this way. And it's saying it has some explanation on it. Some of these have more explanation than others. This is where having a processor that is willing to explain to consumers what these cuts mean, what you're giving up, what you're getting. The FAPSI one you can see here, it's a little bit more simple. You have chuck roast, yes, no. Everything that you don't select for typically gets turned into hamburger. And so there may be consumers that want more hamburger and less roasts. There may be consumers that want all the roasts and less hamburger. It really is personal preference. And so kind of having them know what they want and working through this with the processor. So dressing percentage is important to talk to the consumer about. So the dressing percentage is the portion of the live animal weight that results in a hot carcass. And a hot carcass is the weight of the unchilled carcass in pounds after the head, hide, and internal organs have been removed. So this can vary greatly. So it can be between typically 60 to 64% for beef, but you really need to know your cattle. So if you've done this multiple times, you can give that consumer a little bit more information, or at least a little bit more accurate information. So you can say things like, the last steers I processed, the dressing percentage was 60%, and then you expect to lose another 2 to 5% of that once the carcass is chilled, due mostly to moisture loss. And then the amount of meat that they receive actually depends on how the carcass is broken down as well. So this is a great example from UT Extension. And so over here in the orange boxes, they show that if you only get boneless steaks and roasts trimmed at 1/8 of an inch for a 1,200 pound steer, you're getting about 425 pounds of meat. So if you leave the bones in, that's 500 pounds because the bones have weight. If you do a mixture of bone-in and boneless steaks, you kind of split the difference at 490 pounds. And then they have an example of a Holstein steer that weighs 1,200 pounds, because a Holstein is a little bit less muscular. And so how muscular your animals are really impacts how much freezer beef someone gets. So from that Holstein steer, that person only gets 396 pounds of meat in their freezer. So having this conversation and kind of getting that expectation right, for those of you that are more interested in percentages, for beef cattle, the average dressing percent is about 62%, which we saw in the last slide. And that makes the average take-home percentage live weight 35%. So having that conversation early and talking to them about how much meat you'll receive will help set up proper expectations for this transaction. So hogs, the average take-home percentage is 36%, and for sheep, the average take-home percentage is 25%. So especially on those sheep, getting 25% of a 100 to 150 pound animal might be shocking for the consumer. So consumer talk. It's important to talk to consumer about how much meat they will get. So using those charts, using examples that you have from previous transactions, that would be really the best, because these numbers can vary a lot. If you have consistent cattle at home and you do these transactions frequently, that really is your best bet. So keeping records, I know we talk about keeping records all the time, but keeping records in this context is also important. Again, individual animals can vary. The freezer space question. So if someone is taking a whole beef, that is a lot of freezer space. And so obviously just a little freezer on top of your refrigerator is not going to cut it. According to the USDA, which depending on how it's packaged, depending on what kind of cuts you get, can really vary greatly. It takes about 1 cubic foot of freezer space for every 35 to 40 pounds of meat. So making sure the consumer has the freezer space for that, is ready to take on that much meat, can really help them have a positive experience. So how to charge? By law, you are selling the live animal. This means that the animal should already be sold when you take it to be processed. So you should have already had that transaction. You should have the money in your hands. You have sold a live animal. This means that you won't know what the end weight is in terms of pounds of meat the person receives. You are technically selling by live weight or per head, which are your only options by USDA FSIS. However, if you know that in the past your animals have had a 60% dressing, you can have that conversation with the end consumer and say, hey, these typically dress out at 60%. But technically you should be selling by live weight or per head. You need to know your costs and the premium you would like to charge. So an important note, and I know I say this a lot, is what you need to charge to be profitable may not be what people are willing to pay. So keep that in mind. Again, great records are really important for this so that you know what to charge, and then you can kind of see if the market will support that. There is no tax collected on live animal sales. So that's one benefit of this. You are not collecting taxes on those live animal sales. The end consumer will pay the processor. So it's usually the slaughter fee, per pound processing fee, any add-ons. So basically, once you've had your transaction with the consumer, that's not the end of the consumer paying money. They also have to pay the processor. So having that conversation and making that really clear is important to set up proper expectations. So marketing. Be very careful about wording. You are not selling pounds of meat. You are selling a live animal. So here's a good example of how to say something if you're doing a Facebook post or something like that. I am selling quarter, half, or whole beef. The animals are 1,200 pounds. In the past, a 1,200 pound animal is about 420 pounds of meat. So you're not saying that you're selling pounds of meat. You're clearly saying that you're selling the live animal, but you're setting up that expectation with the client of how much meat to expect, because that's typically going to be their first question of how much meat is that? The wrong way to post it would be, I am selling 420 pounds of meat. That will get you in trouble. That will probably get you flagged. Social media is a good option of getting the info out there, but again, make sure you watch the wording, because I have heard there are like some Facebook police type situations going on. Farmers markets, some require you to have an actual product. So we do have a fact sheet out there with some information about farmers markets, some of the bigger farmers markets, how to contact them, things like that. Again, if you have to have an actual product, you can't really advertise your half told quarters at the farmer's market. Some farmers markets will let you have a sign-up sheet, a flyer, some photos of what your meat looks like, and have people sign up. So just depending on that. Also, farmers markets typically do charge to have your booth. So that's another consideration, is how much money is it going to cost me to be at the farmers market? And then tell your story. Again, people like to think they have the best beef, and maybe you do, but people are also buying the story and buying your way of raising your beef. So making sure to get that information out there to try and capture premiums is important. So conclusions. I still think that there's opportunities in both traditional and direct to consumer. I do think direct to consumer takes a little bit more planning. It is important to map out everything you need to do along the way, make sure that the timing works out for you. Obviously, waiting until it's time to sell calves is probably too late. It sounds like the processors have shorter waiting times than they did like during COVID, when it was months and months in the future, but that's still something that you need to be aware of for your area and what the timeline looks like for those processors. And then communication with the end consumer, so they know what to expect and they are not caught off guard and disappointed. I think that communication piece is really important and will really save you from having big headaches in the end. All right, any questions?
I have been keeping an eye on the chat box, and I don't see anything in the chat box up to this point. It is available. People can chat. I will set it where people can unmute themselves to ask questions over mic as well if they wish. So that's now.
Yeah, I think really the key thing to custom exempt to remember is that you are selling the live animal. So that means like you can't sell it to a restaurant can't resell it. It's clearly labeled not for resale. It is probably one of the easier ways to sell direct to consumer, but there are still some of those issues with making sure you're selling the live animal, making sure the end client is dealing with the processor, that communication piece in terms of the pounds of meat received, and that information is important to get out there. No one's going to stop me with any hard questions today, I guess.
So far, I did share your email through the chat window as well. And we also have a link to our webinar survey. We appreciate your help in filling these out for us and helping us know how we're doing. So that link is in the chat box as well that you can click on.
Yeah, and if anyone has like particular scenarios that they want to ask me about, if I don't know the exact answer, I will find it out for you. Just send me an email or give me a call.
Well, I don't see any questions, so I think we can wrap it up today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Burke, for presenting today. And we do not have our October webinar scheduled, but once we do get it scheduled, I will email everyone and share it over Facebook. So thank you, and we'll see you in October.
Thanks.